So Sam, thank you for taking the time. As you know, a core focus of the event this year is really focusing on the big trends over the next decade, so we can inspire the next generation of founders. And as I look back over the last decade, it's pretty clear that iPhone mobile was really the big paradigm shift of the 2010s. And in a recent interview you did, you mentioned AI as being the paradigm shift of this next decade. Can you elaborate on that? And if you're a student or a founder getting started today, what would your advice be for what they can do to prepare for this paradigm shift?
Yeah, look, paradigm shifts are always hard to call. So I could be wrong here, but it feels to me at this point like if you just look at the sort of Cambrian explosion of new things being built that are, really delighting people, getting real significant usage. It seems to me like AI is the platform that the industry has been waiting for in that sense. And what people are doing with building on top of generative models in all these different modalities is really quite, and I'm excited to see it.
The mobile shift was easy for people to wrap their heads around, right? Because you have a mobile phone in your hand, and I can't remember who said it, but it's kind of the remote control for your life. How do you
think one of the benchmark VCs, but it was a great quote. It really kind of like got that.
Yeah, like you press a button, something happens in the world. What is that pithy statement, you think, for AI as a paradigm shift?
I mean, the way that I talk about it is just like on-demand intelligence that is like, way less expensive and way faster than for these narrow areas than what you could get from a human. So, I think like a category people are quite familiar with now is these image generators. You could definitely like go off and have, like an artistically talented person generate images for you. But it took a while and it was not like close to free. And one of the things that I think we're seeing, which is true for much of technology, is when you make something way faster and way less expensive, it is a qualitative shift in what's possible. And, like people pointed out, when the kind of iPhone as remote control for the world thing came along, they're like, well, why do I need this thing called Uber? I can just like call a taxi. And when the very first image generators launched, it's like, well, why do I need this? I can just like pay an illustrator to do it. But it turns out that like the world doesn't quite work that way. And when these things change by like orders of magnitude on these two axes, it's like really different.
So if the cost of cognitive labor is going to near zero, is it the cost of any type of cognitive labor? So you think that any type of work that requires cognitive function that's not tied to physical labor effectively is game for AI to rewrite and change how we do work?
There will be categories where we want them to be expensive. Like the famous example, there's some name for these kind of goods, Veblen goods maybe, but like people want wine to be more expensive. People like handmade things. They want certain art to be really expensive. So there'll be plenty of things where like it's related to status or exclusivity or something, and we want that to be expensive. There will also be categories where we like, I think, really want a human involved. We don't just want to be talking to a computer. And there will be a lot of things there too. And then I assume, although I don't know exactly what there will be, that for quite some time there will be certain categories where humans are just much better than AI. The way that we're building AI, at least right now, is a very alien intelligence. In the same way that like birds sort of inspired us to build airplanes, but airplanes work super differently than birds or insects or whatever. The intelligence that we're building now is like, somewhat inspired by like how we believe it works in humans, but like very, very, very different approach. And so I suspect there will be like surprising strengths and weaknesses to both kinds. And thus there will be like plenty of roles for humans. I also think like whenever you're on the left side of the sort of, major technological revolution in human history and you try to predict the jobs on the right side, like that's always really hard to do. But
yeah, speaking of predictions, then one thing that's been on my mind is the role of AI in increasing the productivity per engineer or per scientist or per designer. I actually just went through I was actually using Replit and their AI assistant, and I was programming something and I got that done in a fraction of the time it would have taken me even a few months ago. It got me thinking about what is the role of AI going to look like in the next 5 years as a programmer? Is it one where it's an assistant and then you still need to curate the code, or is it truly going to turn into you just speak to the AI in terms of what you're trying to get done, and it'll just do all of the code for you? Like, where on this axis?
Totally a question of timing. I mean, what I expect to happen is that the assistant just makes you more and more efficient and learns to do more and more things with less and less supervision from you, and eventually it gets like really good at the whole thing. But that will take a while. Does that happen in 5 years? Like, yeah, maybe for some tasks. I sort of doubt for all.
Right.
But like 5 years at the rate the field is moving is a very long time. And so I wouldn't want to make any strong bets about what it won't be able to do.
Yeah. But and what's the limit? I was going to say, like, what's the limiting factor that would prevent it from doing all of it? Like, what is that change that's required?
Well, I don't think we know yet where it's going to break down. But there's like many places where I can imagine our current techniques hit some sort of bottleneck. I don't think it'll be anything fatal, but we'll have to go off and do some new research, figure out some, medium-sized or maybe even large-sized new idea. But like the way we have made progress, OpenAI, is we just like knock down whatever's in front of us. And then when we get stuck on something new, we go do more research and figure that out. And, when we started OpenAI, we were kind of felt like more on our own in this way of thinking. But now there's like a lot of the world is operating kind of in this direction and with a lot of excitement and energy. And so I think like things can happen even faster now.
Yeah. You also had a tweet recently that piqued my curiosity and also what led to this ask. I'll state it. AI is a rare example of an extremely hyped thing that almost everyone still underestimates the impact of, even the medium term. I'm curious, like, what are the high probability non-consensus examples of this in the medium term?
I think everyone is like, AI is the new hot thing. I get it. It's cool. It generates these images for me. And people even say like, okay, you know what? Maybe it's going to do all cognitive labor, or 90% of cognitive labor at 1/1000th of the cost or whatever. But if you actually stop and think about what that means, and if you actually stop and think about even further than that, like, okay, once it's going there, and once like AI learns how to do science, and the rate of scientific discovery, scientific progress goes up by like a factor of 1,000, what that means for the world, people may say the words, but they don't seem to be acting like we're heading towards that kind of world very quickly.
And so that's actually fascinating. On the one hand, AI today is an amplifier for humans and can assist humans in adding to the wealth of scientific knowledge. But there's another world that you're describing where AI is adding to scientific knowledge on its own. Did I understand that right?
I actually don't think it matters if it's fully autonomous or if it's helping with humans. What matters is the pace that scientific discovery is happening 1,000 times faster than the world today.
Yeah.
And if it is, that has sort of like breathtaking consequences for society. But whether it's fully autonomous or not.
Yeah. And what do you think the limiters would be in that world? Is the rate of adding to scientific knowledge then really going to be limited by physical atoms? Or do you think?
No, I should add, by the way, we said earlier on this call that the price of intelligence, the cost of intelligence, trends toward near zero. That's what I hope happens. But maybe there's like a bunch of other reasons where like electricity gets super expensive, GPUs get super expensive, and like it kind of just, there's like a market price for intelligence, and it doesn't fall as fast as we'd hope because the inputs just sort of like rise in price like crazy. I don't think that's what's going to happen, but it could. But assuming it doesn't, like, think about how much society has changed in the last few hundred years. Now, there are just some limits to how fast I think society can change and how quickly people and institutions take to update and do things in new ways and whatever. You see where people get pretty set in their ways, and not always negative or bad ways, but that could happen. But imagine that all of the scientific progress since the beginning of the Enlightenment until now, we had in a 1-year period. And also it's like this exponential curve, so it gets really steep in the next 500 years or whatever. What happens if you compress all of that into one? Everything that we're due on the current trajectory in 500 years into one.
Mm-hmm.
It's chaotic for sure. Society has a hard time adapting for sure, but we can cure all disease. We can travel to the stars. We have unlimited power. Who knows? But that's something that I think, that's in the underhyped category.
Yeah. I know that OpenAI does a lot of work around societal structures as well, right? How does society need to evolve? What are the top 3 things, or even the top thing you're thinking of to help society adapt to this rate of change? Because what you're talking about is the rate of change is increasing year by year. And society itself, even if we look at it today, has had a hard time adapting to the rate of change for the last decade. Theoretically, if you end up adding all of the scientific knowledge over the past several hundred years in 1 year, things break. So I'm curious,
so there's a lot of things that people have been talking about a lot that I'm not going to rehash. How do we reskill people for new jobs? How do we build resilience? How do we build better judgment so people know if they're kind of looking at fake content, generated content or not? There's all of the stuff that people have already discussed. I will talk about 3 other things that I think are under discussed rather than rehash the same, even though I think those are important and huge. Number 1 is I think we're really just going to have to think about how we share wealth in a very different way than we have in the past. The fundamental forces of capitalism and what make that work, I think, break down a little bit. And so, is it some version of a basic income or basic wealth redistribution, or some sort of version like that? We're trying to study that. I think it's collectively underexplored. And again, I think people just haven't internalized what happens if the playing field shifts this much. So they assume we can just sort of tweak, a small tweak on capitalism will work. Number 2 is how access to these systems work. So the resource that I think should matter most in a world with AGIs in it is who gets time slices to use the AGI, what we decide it gets used for, stuff like that. And I think that's just going to require thinking about access to that limited resource in a very different way. And then the third one is governance, who decides what you get to use the systems for, what the rules are, what they will do and not do. How do we get to global agreement, treaties, whatever it's going to take on that topic? How do we agree on what the set of values is going to be? And I don't think we're so those are 3 things that I think we're are going to be really important and that we're not well suited for.
How do you, that last point's really interesting on the governance piece. How does it not turn into who has the biggest guns gets to control how to govern this type of a system?
I think there's a bunch of examples of why it's not gonna go that way. I think the kind of nuclear mutually assured destruction rollout was bad for a bunch of reasons, but it's still interesting to study, and it's even more interesting to study the paths we didn't take there that were also considered. But I think when you have something that threatens to upset the global equilibrium, there's just a lot of possibility there.
And you said something else that was really interesting around the basic assumptions of capitalism or capitalist society starts breaking down, especially as you have this AGI that takes off. Can you expand on that a little bit more? Is it that you think most of the problems will effectively be solved, or if there is a problem, then the AGI can solve it, since the cost of intelligence is getting to near zero? So the assumptions that we have had of a past society of entrepreneurs and capitalists around it and creating value, like all of that changes? Is that where you're?
Yeah, I mean, if you let yourself like think out sci-fi fiction dream world really far, where you can be like, okay, AGI, start a new $1 trillion company.
Yeah.
And it can like be the CEO, it can figure out how to go raise capital, it can do all of the engineering, it can do the marketing, it can do the distribution or whatever. And you type this like one thing into a prompt and pushed enter, and it like went off and did that. Like, that's weird. And how we like think about a world like that is not super obvious.
Yeah. It's I mean, the theme of the event is over the next decade, but I had a question here, over the next century, what does this look like? And
century's too far. I don't know how to predict that far now. That's in the fog of war.
But digging into a bit of what you're saying, thought I had was, what if you had an AI that can actually sense problems and frustrations that people are having, determines what the product is, the company needs to be, design and writes the code, ships it. Like, where are people actually needed in the value chain, right?
It's a good question.
In the value chain.
It's a good question.
And you just have this system that just keeps feeding on itself and goes, I am here to serve humanity, and I will solve any and all problems for humanity, and I will capture some value to pay for my energy, and then off
That's
you.
That's fine, but then like, who gets that? The excess value created, like, who gets that?
Exactly.
Like, there's an answer under our current system. I don't think it would quite work.
Yeah. Whoever puts in that first line that says build $1 trillion company.
Doesn't feel quite right.
Yeah. And related to this, what are the quality of life impacts that you think we're going to see? So assuming we figure out the governance mechanisms and we figure out a lot of the hairier questions to solve around who gets the end value, putting that aside, I've heard you say we're going to have the ability to have incredible educators. So a very personalized education system for each person, medical care. What are some of the other things that you think will be significantly better in a world with AGI?
I think there's probably nothing that I can say here that is new and insightful. I kind of believe it's like all going to get a lot better really quickly, and it won't always be in the ways that we think. Like, if you ask people what they wanted from an AI a year ago, even the people who spend all day every day generating images now and found all these great use cases for it probably wouldn't have said that. They might have said like, I want a better search engine, or maybe they would have said, I want, a better Copilot or something. But like, also before we launched Copilot, like, no one believed models could write code this well. And so like, I kind of think the answer is we're just going to like, when we see something useful we think the technology can do, we're just going to try to put it out there in the world and then hope it keeps getting copied.
Yep. Makes sense. So it's a little bit more emergent than anything else.
For sure.
Right. So we're essentially discovering new ways to using technology versus imagining some like future that's far out and saying this is exactly what it's going to turn into. So that makes sense. And then how do you think about the value chain? So getting a little bit more into startup generation and startup creation around AI. How do you think about what that value chain ends up looking like? Is it that there's one company like OpenAI that everyone feeds into for the model? I've heard you describe there's a middle layer where you have more specific models, but then what happens at the tail end of that? Is it is that really just a consumer interface that sits on that model? How do you think about the value chain evolving?
My guess is, there will be areas where you can go far with small models like image generation, for example, and those will just widely proliferate. My guess is that the most powerful models will be quite large. There'll be a relatively small part of the world number of companies in the world that can train them. But yes, then the value that is built on top of those with fine tuning or whatever else will just be absolutely tremendous.
And what are some examples of the fine tuning, and like, why is that at a different layer than the bigger model?
Once you have trained a pretty good base model, then let's say you have like now a pretty good general purpose text model, but what you really want is a legal model, like AI lawyer base.
Right.
And you could go train from scratch, something that would like try to say like, do everything that a first year legal associate could do. But that'd be hard for a bunch of reasons. One of which is the model wouldn't have learned basic reasoning, and others, it wouldn't have all the world knowledge of everything else. But if you start with this model that knows everything, a little bit, and then give it just a little bit of data to push it in the direction of being a really good lawyer. I think that's a much easier path and sort of what I would expect more of.
As you think about the base model and what it needs to learn relative to the more specific model, what's the difference? What's an example that the base model just needs to learn because that's the base for everything? And then what's an example that that was a good framing for the first legal associate. What's something that needs to learn on specifically?
Well, it needs to be, familiar with like all, I don't know, case law ever,
right,
for example, and it needs to be able to like know the standard kinds of things that first year associates are expected to do. And it needs to have like practice drafting documents and getting comments back from a partner and incorporating those and everything like that.
Right. Got it. So the base model is basically training on everything.
I know. I understand the whole world, yeah.
I got it. So understand the whole world, and now I have to understand the legal world. And so that's how you think about these more specific models and how they get trained.
Yep.
Got it. Fascinating. So if someone kind of going back now to one of the first questions I asked, if you're a student or a founder today, if you were to point them in a single direction for how to prepare for this world, would you say, go work for a company like OpenAI? Would it be just start doing some AI research, or just start building
anything in the field? Like start building, come to OpenAI, whatever. You just like don't miss out on this one. Like just get up to speed now. Would be my advice. However you want to do it.
Yep, makes total sense. Well, great, Sam. I want to be respectful of your time.
Thanks for having me. It's really nice to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. Have a good one.